Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to be talking with Christia Spears Brown. Christia is a developmental psychologist. She is an author, researcher, and professor of developmental psychology. She's also the director of the Center for Equality and Social Justice at the University of Kentucky. She has her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. And her research focuses on how children develop gender and ethnic stereotypes, along with how discrimination and stereotypes affect children and their lives as they move into the future. She has written many articles and many books. Her most recent is Unraveling Bias, How Prejudice Has Shaped Children for Generations and How to Break the Cycle. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. We first start by giving an overview of bias in our society currently, where it sits at, where it lands, or how kind of the landscape of bias in our society. We give a definition of bias. We talk about whether bias can ever be positive and what are some of the human differences in reception of bias. We talk about implicit versus explicit bias. We give some of the history of institutions and how bias shows up in many institutions in the United States. We talk about how bias shows up in schools. We mention Title IX and its ever-evolving expansion. We talk about girls in STEM programs. We talk about some of the progress and work that still has to be done with kids and adolescents in the LGBTQ+ community. And then we just kind of end the conversation about where the future is headed and how we can have good cultural change. I have to say that this was a really fun conversation to have. Obviously, it's a serious issue about bias, but she's absolutely wonderful in talking about this issue, and she's devoted, much of her professional life to researching bias. And so she's been doing this for many decades now, and she's quite the authority on it. And I had such a wonderful time. She's brilliant, and she's a very wonderful person. And so I'm really happy to bring the conversation with Christia Spears Brown. I'm here with Christia Spears Brown. Christia, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Of course, yeah. So you have written a book called Unraveling Bias, How Prejudice Has Shaped Children for Generations and Why It's Time to Break the Cycle. Is this your first book, second, third? Where is this for you?
It's my third, but the middle one was one really just for an academic audience. So, but this is my second one meant for, actual people to read besides just other researchers.
Well, that's great. Yeah, that's great. Well, tell us who you are and what you do, where you work, things you research, all the good stuff.
Yeah. I am a developmental psychologist, and I study how kids, gender, ethnicity, the social groups they belong to, how it shapes their development. So things about stereotypes and discrimination and how that affects how their school lives work, how their families' lives work, how they think about themselves. So my day job is as a professor of psychology at the University of Kentucky, and I'm also the associate dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion at my university. So.
You're on the other side of Appalachia. I'm in Western Maryland, so you're kind of, well, it depends. I guess it depends on which part of Kentucky you're in, but
we're in the not Appalachia, so we're on the on the other side. Yeah,
on the other side. Yeah, that's great. And how long have you been doing this work? I mean, did you start out doing this when you were in grad school and stuff, or you just kind of found your way into it, or how'd you get into it?
Yeah, I went to graduate school to study how kids develop stereotypes, and started studying the impact of experiencing discrimination while in graduate school. That was what my dissertation was back in what's now the dark ages. And I have been a professor for almost 20 years. So I've been doing research on this topic since the late 90s. And so that research has evolved over time, as we've gotten better understanding of gender identity, for example, as we realize that gender is much more diverse than we used to recognize. I spend a lot more time thinking about and talking about the ways in which gender develop in unique ways with kids. When I first started graduate school, I focused on kind of race stereotyping, really thinking about white and black kids for the most part, but became increasingly interested in kids of immigrants. And I'm in a community where there's a really large Mexican immigrant population. So now I've done a lot more research with Mexican immigrant kids. So for me, the ideas stay the same. How do these groups that kids belong to, when there's negative baggage and cultural stereotypes associated with it, how does that shape kids? And some of the details change over time.
Well, that's wonderful. You definitely sound like you've done the work in the trenches, and you've worked you all the way up, and you've just it's a really nice career so far. It sounds like of doing this work. So that's great to hear. I feel honored now to just to have the expert on this. So that's great. That's great. Okay, so I want to talk all about your book, and we can get into many of the specifics, and we'll start general and get into the specifics. So I guess one just kind of, I'm going to tee you up here for this. How would you say is the landscape in which we're living in terms of our environment, social environment, et cetera, of how bias shows up in our society? So you talk about this throughout the whole book. And so just kind of give us the lay of the land. What's the landscape we're kind of working in 2022?
Yeah, I think and this was really kind of a theme that I worked through. I tried to, at least a lot in the book, is that I think across a lot of society, we see these really two strong themes going, and it's sometimes at odds. So we still have a lot of biases in our laws. In 2022, we are still working out in the court system and in the ballot what kinds of laws we want to have. So, right now it's issues about, should trans kids play on sports teams or use certain bathrooms? How should we divide up school funding based on certain kinds of neighborhoods? We're still working through these things in like the policies we have. And so biases play out in those kinds of big policies and rules that we set, that we hear it on the politicians, right? Depending on which politician's in power at the time, kind of prejudices come out. So we have that going. But we also realize that it's really hard to change people's attitudes at these deep-seated levels. There's a reason we see such a cultural kind of conflict right now, right, between the right and the left, or conservatives and progressives, or kind of however we want to think about it. People really have deeply entrenched beliefs that are really hard to change. And that sometimes comes out also in the forms of biases that are about, what are immigrants like? What's, kind of how much do we want to have our kids go to school with kids that look different than them? How do we think about the sexualization of girls and boys that get teased? All that stuff we hold these beliefs that are also hard to change. So part of what I try to work through in the book is the big landscape is that we have it still embedded in our laws, and we have it still embedded in our kind of hearts and minds. And it's hard to change one without changing the other. So it's kind of, how do we figure out how to tackle all this? Because I think we have to deal with both.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That's kind of how you lay the book out. As I was reading it, I was like, oh, you're basically taking that kind of, at least the first 3/4 of the book is really like, here's kind of, quasi history of what it looks like in our institutions. And then also, kind of what it looks like, I guess you could say, in society or in culture at large, in different areas. So how do you define bias, right? I mean, there's ways in which I think that's used clinically. I think that's used colloquially. So you talk about stereotypes, and you talk about prejudices, and you talk about policies and laws. So how do you just define bias, and maybe the different, subcategories, and how it shows up?
Right. I mean, I think in some ways we think about it as kind of the ABCs of what we call intergroup relations, which is, I guess, the more clinical term of it all. So A being the attitude. So one form of bias are biased attitudes in which you prefer one group over another. So if we talk about race, for example, if you prefer kind of your own racial group, so I am white, if I prefer whites to everybody else, I just feel more comfortable with whites. And that's just who I have higher levels of comfort and preference for, that's one form of bias. So in my attitudes, that's kind of what we think of as prejudice. There's also B, which is the behavioral component, which is discrimination. So if I choose to hire people that look like me, or if I somehow give resources to more towards people that look like me than other groups, if I pick people to be on my team that look like me, right? There's lots of big and minor ways we can show discrimination. Sometimes it's what we call microaggressions. It can be the really subtle ways in which I comment on how your name is really unusual, and are you really from here, or where's your family from? And those kind of othering types of behaviors are really common. That's one way in which we see bias. It's also the C of that ABC is the cognitions, which are stereotypes and beliefs about what other people are like. So if I believe that people that look like Arab American, that identify as Muslim, if I think that they're maybe more dangerous and more likely to be a threat to me, that's a stereotype I have about what Muslims are like. And so that's a belief. It's related to my attitudes, but it's like a specific, I think this group is like that. If I think girls are not very good at math or not likely to be brilliant, and boys are really not good at making social interactions, those are stereotypes. And then you also just see it in our policies. So those are a little bit harder to find sometimes, but we know that policies that contribute and reinforce disparities or inequalities are also biased. So if there's policies in which one racial group is disproportionately affected, for example, like the crack versus cocaine differences in terms of sentencing, in which one group one racial group is more likely to use one type of drug than the other, and that has a much heavier sentence attached to it. And so you see disproportionate sentencing of blacks compared to whites for basically the exact same drug offense, right? So there's a biased policy, and we know it's biased because we can see these disparities in the outcome. So the end result looks different. So therefore the policy's got these biases embedded. So it's really all of that, which explains why it's so hard to change. The other part of all bias is that sometimes we're aware of it and sometimes we're not. So there's like the implicit biases that occur at a really automatic level. And then there's the more explicit ones, the ones I have a little bit more control over. And so we know that the implicit ones are really hard to change too. So that leads to a whole other set of problems.
So I guess my question, to follow up with that is that it's pretty, I don't think anyone would argue this or deny this, that, we all carry around biases, obviously. I mean, for various reasons. Is it always seen with this kind of negative valence, or is there ways in which there are, you choose your word, good, positive, adaptive, any positive term you want to use, where it could be helpful or advantageous to have a certain bias? I mean, we'll talk about many of the pernicious aspects of bias in culture and institutions, but do we ever see this in a way where bias is helpful, or it's a good, quote unquote, a good thing? Or is it just like 90% terrible, and then like maybe sometimes it's okay? Like, or is that just a kind of a false dichotomy?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things to differentiate. So sometimes people will say, I can have positive beliefs about a group. So, Asians are good at math, right? That's a positive valenced stereotype. I would say that's always bad because it assumes one group can do a thing and individuals are way too unique, right? So that's just not accurate. Sure. But the other part of the question is, having biases ever good? This is where it's a really fine distinction. It is always good to like the group you're in, right? Okay. Like you don't want to be, so part of that affect, the A is, the prejudice. It's showing you have preferences for your group over other groups. Well, we don't want, especially in the context of kids, we don't want them to think poorly about the group they belong to. Like you're in the group you're in, right? You're in your gender group, you're in your ethnic group. So we don't want people to think poorly of their group. Right. And so in that sense, having positive beliefs about your group is good because it's part of how we define ourselves and it's part of our social identity. Sure. The fine distinction then becomes, but is it at the expense of devaluing other groups? So if we can figure out how to maintain positive beliefs about our group, at the same time having value and respect for other groups, then I think we're skating on the kind of right side of that.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think, again, as we'll get into, the many things in the environment and many things in our society don't always tend to push for that. It's always, you have to be proud of your group or one way in which you identify at the expense of someone else. Not always, but I think a majority of the time that's what we see. And, that's, again, that can be very difficult. I guess I always wonder, you were talking about some of the examples there. And so I'll just give an example for myself. So my dad's an immigrant, and maybe more accurately would be, he would, I guess, be labeled a refugee now, and maybe at current standards. He came here over 40 years ago. And so I'm first generation, at least partially. And so I have two funny names, first and last name. And so, or people know I'm not quite, white American entirely. They know some of my features, or, again, my name, or some things like that. But again, this is an interesting thing, and I don't know what to say about it. I guess that just for me personally, when people have asked those types of things, oh yeah, but where's your family from, or your country of origin things, those things never really bothered me. Now I know that they can bother other people, right? But sometimes maybe we can be, I think, respectful of other people, but sometimes people don't legitimately mind, or they'll say like, oh, well, your name is different, or things like that. And yeah, that's totally fine. Is it sometimes where, how do we, I guess, this might be too prescriptive, but how do we operate in a space where we can, of course we can check our own biases, but how do we also not be, too concerned about, maybe if someone doesn't mind if you ask about where their family's from, or things like that. How do we kind of walk that line? That's a tough line, but how do we walk that line, you think?
Yeah, and I think you're completely right. I mean, we all have individual variation, right? And what we think is comfortable or not, right? So different things bother all of us. And some people are more easily offended about anything, and that's just a human differences. I do think where I see, I have lots of conversations with folks about these kinds of topics. And so I've heard lots of different responses. Where I see people being most bothered by that particular example of kind of asking about it I think it is, how is it being asked? Because I think it's one thing to say, where's your family from? There's ways to be respectful about it, as opposed to saying, and what I've heard lots of people say is, what are you? I've had that reported to me so many times, that people say to them, what are you? So I find in one situation, it's how it's asked, right? The second is the situation in which it's asked. So I also hear lots of folks say, they're asked that at the grocery store or the doctor's office, or when they're just kind of trying to get on with their life. They're not asked that in the context of, let's build a friendship and we're new colleagues, so let's go get a coffee together. And I might self-identify, I describe where I'm from, and you would just, it's not part of that relationship building, which is a normal time to ask that. And then it's also always in the context of the other experiences that person is having, and that we don't really have much control over. So maybe that person has a lot of experiences where they're made to feel othered, or made to feel like not an American, and maybe they want to feel that way. And so being constantly reminded that you're not the norm, you're different than that, you can never be a real, air quotes, American, for them, it hits more of a nerve, because it's one more reminder of feeling excluded. And some of us differ in how much that matters. So I think it's all of those, but I think as the asker of those questions, is it important, this conversation, that I know where this person's from? And how can I, if I'm curious, and just because I'm interested in the way, people are, can I do it in a way that really respects the person's humanity, and is really driven out of a kindness and an empathy and, oh, let's share something about ourselves. I think if it comes with that spirit versus a more kind of hostile spirit, I think it makes a big difference.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with everything you're saying. I think that definitely in the context, how and where, and I think you're right. What's the motivation or perceived motivation, right? Right. If you're in line at the grocery store and someone's asking, "What are you?" Yes, that's terrible. If you're at a party though, and, or you're at a a friend's house and you meet someone and that makes a lot more sense. And maybe not the first thing you ask the person, but as the conversation goes, it comes up, or I agree with you on that. You talk mostly in the book about bias in gender, in terms of gender, race, and disability, which we'll get to. But and again, I can't talk about everything in one book. But where else do we see? We hear about bias in those categories a lot. Just as maybe a small footnote of sorts. Where else do we see bias outside of those kind of categories?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big one. I think so. The ones in the book a lot are race, ethnicity, like immigration status, gender identity, sexual orientation. Those are the ones that I typically focus on. But you do see a lot based on things like weight. Is one that's less that, I don't really research, but is clearly there. So we have a lot of weight-based discrimination, and a lot of stereotypes and things that go along with that. We see it, I just got finished at work doing a thing looking at accents is an interesting way, kind of your reference about Appalachia. People with really strong Southern Appalachian accents face a lot of bias and stigma that we see play out in a lot of different ways. And so I think that's an issue in which, like our students, for example, I live in a city that's very kind of Midwestern, but you see students that come in with really kind of heavy Southern accents and face a lot of biases. So that's also one. And then I think, the issue about just social class. So I don't really talk a lot about that, but and partly though it overlaps with race and ethnicity, but social class is an important one. So particularly, people that are low income, that live under the poverty line, that are, don't have permanent homes. There's a lot of bias that goes there. And then a lot of things related to health, right? So disabilities of kind of developmental disabilities or physical disabilities. It's not something I study a lot of. I study more like the social group part of it. But we also know that there's a lot, especially for kids, that really affects kids' experiences.
Just on the accent piece, that's super interesting because, so obviously listeners may, have in their mind someone that comes from another country and they have an accent because English isn't their first language. But I've heard an often amount of times that people that are from like kind of the deep South and they move to, let's say, New England or the Mid-Atlantic or something, where they will really augment their natural accent, which still to this day surprises me. And maybe it shouldn't, but I remember one time someone told me this and I said, they're like, oh yeah, I had to really rein it back a little bit because I'm from, whatever state, in deep South. And I'm like, oh, why would you do that? Why? That's how you talk. Like, why would you change how you talk? That's how you naturally talk. Well, I didn't want people to think that, I was dumb or I didn't know stuff or I was, from around the way, backwoods kind of what. And I really was listening to their experience and I was like, oh my goodness. I was like, that's wild. That shouldn't happen. That's wild.
Yeah. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. And then I went to University of Texas in Austin for graduate school. And then I started my academic career as a professor at UCLA. So I had lived in Tennessee and Texas and was a professor in Los Angeles. And so I would start teaching a class and within I don't know, the first 5 minutes, some kid would, very cautiously raise their hand. And the very first question I was always asked is, where are you from? And so it was because of my accent. Right. And so I very much relate to that idea of regulating your accent because there are so many stereotypes about the South. And the people from the South are very aware of them because people are very blatant about them. Yeah, I know people that have been asked if they wear shoes, how many people they know that can read, really
goodness.
atrocious stereotypes that you forget are still used. I mean, those are things I've heard. So yeah, it's an interesting way in which, and also if you look at how the Southerners are depicted in media, it's never that they're smart. So it's like we have lots of stereotypes and biases. Some are a little more socially acceptable than others, and I would say that's a pretty socially acceptable one to express. But what's interesting for me as a person that does this research, and I do a lot of talks, particularly like anti-bias trainings and talks like that, is it's actually really helpful because I am in kind of the Mid-South, because what I find is that I can use that as a reference point for my audiences that are predominantly white to help them start to understand the impact of racism on people. And so, because I can talk about what it feels like for them about stereotypes, because everyone is really aware of Southern stereotypes. And so it is an interesting entry point for me that's a little less threatening. It's a little less socially laden as a way to kind of get people to ease into the conversation of whites' racism towards everybody else.
Yeah. It's just super interesting that, when I hear people say stuff like that. And so it always blows me away. You talk about implicit versus explicit bias. You've already mentioned it earlier. So just help us, I guess, if you just kind of unpack that a little bit more. I mean, obviously the explicit is things you kind of see and know and are pretty obvious. Implicit is less known, but maybe just if you want to unravel that a little bit on the implicit versus explicit kinds of bias.
Yeah, I mean, so implicit biases are really the things that occur, the idea is that it occurs at kind of a unconscious level, it's kind of a subconscious level. Really, how researchers are now thinking about it is that it is just because we've seen so many patterns shown in media, most commonly, that our brain has made those pattern detection. So we've detected those patterns. So we've seen, Black men portrayed as criminals so many times, really by the time we're about, 6 or 7, that link between that social group and that attribute, violence and, Black men, has been made. The connections, those kind of neural connections are strongly connected, are strongly attached now. And so because of that, they operate really easily. I always say it's kind of like a groove in a ditch, right? Where a wagon has gone back and forth so many times, it's led to a groove. And so water just kind of naturally flows there and it's hard to actually get out of the groove. So it's this idea that you've seen so many things linked over time that your brain has made those associations. And so it is really easy when one part of that gets activated to activate the other part. So then when I see a Black man, as the example, the characteristics of violent become almost automatically triggered just because they're so closely linked to my brain because those associations have been made. So the neurochemical pathway, which is both electrical and chemical, it has made that linkage really strong and fast. And so it's this idea that we are all implicitly biased to a degree, because I say, if we live in the world for about 5 minutes, we've picked up these implicit associations and implicit biases. It's not to say we believe it in our hearts, so our explicit beliefs may be different. The problem, though, is those implicit biases that we all hold are more likely to be activated. We're more likely to rely on that kind of autopilot of our implicit biases if we're operating really quickly and under cognitive load. So if we're stressed out and trying to respond really quickly, we're more likely to respond with those implicit kind of reactions, because that's the autopilot of our brain. It takes us slowing down and really being thoughtful before our other more explicit, consciously felt and believed ideas can take over. It's like people believe that people should be treated equally, but their brains made all these patterns. And so the belief doesn't always take place. It's the automatic stuff, unless we're really working hard to override them.
I haven't really heard it expressed that way. And I think that's it's definitely instructive, I think, in a lot of ways, in terms of like you have the implicit bias, but you don't, where it rises to consciousness or to the surface level, it doesn't mean that you're actually believing what's there. It's what you're attuned to, which is interesting, which is an interesting way to conceptualize it that way. In terms of, I'm going to shift here a little bit. We'll obviously come back to that, I think, a little bit later, but as we mentioned, the first part of the book is about in institutions, and there certainly is biases in institutions for many groups. How does racial bias, I should say, is how does that turn up in the court systems historically? Yeah, I'll let you answer that part, and then just kind of like where we're at now. But how do we see that? I mean, obviously it's a very long history, but of sorts. But how do we see racial bias within our court systems in the United States?
Well, I think the most obvious one, and the one that I really kind of center a lot of the book around, is through the segregation of schools, right? That started, in the late 1800s, really, and went. I mean, it got codified. It, got kind of put into our laws in the late 1800s, and then really went through until really in practice around the 1970s. And so basically the idea that it allowed schools to segregate on the basis of race and said that that was fine. And it's an issue that comes up time and again, is the courts saying in various ways, as long as you provide equal opportunities and equal facilities, then it's okay for people to be separate. And so I think, we hear all about that, about the Jim Crow era of schools and water fountains. We think of that as like the 50s and the big civil rights movement. But that had been working through the courts for decades. And we also tend to think that it was fixed in the 50s, but the courts have a really good way of passing the buck a bit and saying, well, we'll let someone else figure that out. And so they did that. And so it wasn't really until much later that schools were actually legally forced to integrate themselves. And what we're seeing now in kind of the modern era is schools. So, I think the Brown v. Board of Education, that desegregated schools, very famous. It's what I talk a lot about in the book. And schools, or this court said, don't worry about it, just do it as soon as you can. And what we see is that whenever we tell people, stop being biased, just do it, get around to it when you can, the reality is they never get around to it. And so schools never got around to it. And then courts finally said, you have to desegregate. And so schools did. Well, then the court said, okay, you've done a good job. So now we're going to stop monitoring you. Like once you reach a certain level of integration, we'll stop monitoring you. And then the courts relax the degree to which they're monitoring. And then what you see, as soon as that oversight gets removed, schools start to resegregate. And so that's where we're at now. The courts stopped a lot of oversight. And now schools are resegregating at rates similar to what it was in the 50s.
So let me ask it this way, I guess. When this, so late 1800s, was there, is there a charitable view of this, that there was, this is Reconstruction, post-Civil War, we don't want to integrate right now, maybe it might be harmful in some way? Or was there some like ignorant kind of thing? Or was this purely like, nope, we just want to keep this segregated as much as possible between blacks and whites, and, with students, students of, that were black, and other students were white? Or was it, I guess I'm just trying to, was it always pernicious? I mean, sometimes things whether they are ignorant about it, and not that that's an excuse, but they might have a different understanding of things, and then it just is a artifact? Or was this from the beginning a racial prejudice from when it started?
It's hard to have a more charitable view than to say it was just about race from the beginning. It started in the 1850s. So, I mean, it's always about, let me say it this way. It's not actually always about race. It is always about power and resources. And race is a good way to divide up those power and resources. So I would say it's always about money.
Okay.
I think. And then we put race as a way to make sure the group in power, which are white people who are making the rules, get to keep the money. I would say we see that all the way back from the 1700s, from really the beginning. It was about that. And so in the 1800s, there was some integration of schools. But you're right. As more people started going to schools, there was fixed resources. There was not enough money for all the kids that needed to be educated. So they had to decide, well, then who are we going to educate? It's the same reason that girls were not educated at the beginning. And then when girls were educated, that's when they realized, oh, we need a lot more teachers. And so we got to figure out how to get more teachers without spending more money. Let's figure out who we can pay less. So we hired a lot of women. So education became something that women did. So it was always about resources. So race is not that different. And so we've seen from the beginning, though, it wasn't just about schools. So Plessy versus Ferguson, which is what allowed schools to segregate on the basis of race. That's the separate but equal, kind of the famous law that says separate but equal. That was based on actually who could sit on a rail car, so a railroad. And Plessy of that was actually only 1/8 Black. So he was mostly what we would call white, I guess. He had Creole, and he was, from Louisiana, and it was kind of multiracial, but would be largely white by our standards. And he really was part of an activist group, and they were trying to push laws towards segregation. So he very purposefully, just like Rosa Parks did later on, very purposefully sat on a rail car, in the railroad to push for the law change. But the court said, no, separate is fine as long as it's equal. And then schools started using that as the precedent. And so, it took 60 years to get that change when it came to schools. And schools were desegregated really kind of earlier than a lot of places. And it was really because they said, well, this is really harming kids. So it was a policy that was originally about adults, but then was applied to schools. And I think because of the harm it was doing to kids was a big part of the reason that it changed. But your bigger question of when the law changed, it was really in the 50s. It was really because people were starting to be uncomfortable with segregation. So it is not as though the law swept in and changed. Right. It was that it also was aligned with the changing attitudes of the time. And so the judges really struggle with, and they do today. You see this exact same issue with trans youth's rights, the same issue of, should the court make big sweeping changes that go against what people believe? Sometimes it's like, yeah, they have to. And that's what they did in Brown v. Board. I
guess the question I have here is that it's interesting, right? Because you're saying how there was this, they make this change and this progress in the 50s, and really to I guess the 70s is where, we started to have desegregation. But you mentioned that there was resegregation now. How did you mean that? I mean, in a nefarious way like it was back then, or in a different way?
I don't think anyone ever thinks it's themselves thinks it's nefarious.
Okay.
I think that the people back then didn't think it was nefarious. They thought, well, no, the black students will feel really uncomfortable if they're going to school with these white students who are so much more advanced. We're really protecting them by sending them to their own school. And so I think that they thought no one wants to think of themselves as racist. And that was true in the 50s. I would venture to say, I wasn't alive, but I would venture to say that was true in the 50s as well as it is today. Sure. There's the American dream ethos is deeply embedded, that if we work hard, we can achieve our dreams, and all men are created equal. We've really swallowed that idea. Really, it's really ingrained in that American ethos. Sure. And so it's just, we have a really good way of justifying our behaviors, though, and still keep that belief intact. So I would say in the 50s, people thought, of course, everyone's treated equally, or, should be treated equally. However, it's really important that these kids get this kind of school because they're going to go to college, and that's really important for them, right? And these folks are just going to be farmers, so they're okay going to this, kind of tar-covered shack. And so now, it's not nefarious per se. I think this is what's tricky about bias. I don't think it is. I think it is much more subtle than that. And so what we see now are parents who look on greatschools.org and see the 2 rating for their neighborhood school, so they move to a better neighborhood so that their kid can go to a school that's got an 8 or a 9 ranking. And what they're also doing is going to a school that has a lot more funding, that draws from a much deeper tax base, and is also predominantly white. So you have then schools that are segregated because of parent choice. So white parents often have more money than other parents, particularly Black and Latino parents. And so they can choose to move to certain areas where their kids can go to school with quote unquote high achieving kids. Those just happen to be other white affluent kids. Black and Latino families that maybe have fewer economic resources are then left in the neighborhood. And so that school becomes, because of the removal of the white students, becomes increasingly Black and Latino.
I could definitely see that. It's I wonder though if I don't have the numbers. You may know more than I do, of course, but I'm just thinking of, it's sort of anecdotal, but I used to live in a county right outside DC. So it was a pretty affluent county. And for a variety of reasons, it's people from all over the world that live. Yeah, it's DC, right? There's so many people, diplomats, and people that work in government or foreign ministry, things like that. But there's so many people that come from different parts of the world, and in fact, many of you're right about everything you just said about the whole, like in terms of schools that get more funding, etc. But many of the schools in that county have extremely diverse. Extremely diverse. People from various parts of Asia, people from Latin America, people from different Eastern and Western Europe, and then obviously, just people, Americans that have generations here in the United States. And that's also interesting because it's like, people, exactly what you're saying, parents want their kids to go to the best schools, which is nothing wrong with that per se. But they would have these schools, and they have all these high rankings, and they have more funding, and they also happen to be very racially and ethnically diverse as well. Is that become a kind of some forms of urbanization? So if you have certain major cities that have lots of mixing, right? People that are immigrating from different parts of the country or different other countries, and they're coming to cities to work or around cities to work, that the school systems are going to just by nature be more multi-ethnic and diverse by race, or how do we, and subsequent to that, does that mean that in other parts of the country where there's less of that migration, does that mean that it's going to be kind of that problem that you were discussing, or how do we see that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that school is an anomaly in the country. I mean, they
Yeah,
exist. I mean, those schools definitely exist. And
sure,
I think
sure.
each community you can find some of those.
Hmm.
But I think that that's a really unique
Sure.
example of a school.
Hmm.
And there's definitely regional variations for sure
Hmm.
on all of these things.
Hmm.
But regional variations, interestingly, in ways that I think are a little counterintuitive or maybe against the stereotypes you're talking about before.
Hmm.
For example, like in the South, it's actually the most integrated, but largely because they had the most rules that made them be
Hmm.
integrated.
Interesting.
So where you see places like New Jersey and New York are actually have the most segregated schools.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And so a big part of this is um, the changing I mean, part of this is the changing demographics of the country.
Sure.
But just looking at the numbers, 1988 was the point at which was peak desegregation.
Hmm.
It has become steadily less integrated in the almost 30 years, I guess, since then.
Hmm.
And the numbers are kind of continuously changing. Just looking at the stats, like the percentage of schools that are what we would call segregated. So that
Hmm.
means between 90 and 100% of the students are Black and Latino. So
Okay.
that's just as a little caveat of all this.
Hmm.
Schools are not traditionally all Black or all, so Black and Latino kids typically go to school together.
Hmm. Hmm.
White kids go to school often with Asian kids.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you see this real kind of divide. But the percentage of schools that were 90% or above just Black and Latino students, so what we'd call kind of a highly segregated, students of color,
Hmm.
since 1988 has tripled.
Hmm.
So about 18% of schools in the country are now 90% or above Black and Latino.
Wow.
And in 88, which was right when they were having some policy changes, it was only like 6% of schools.
Hmm.
Um,
This is nationally, right?
this is national. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
national numbers. And it is definitely, there's a ton of regional variation.
Sure, sure, sure.
And so that's an important point. And so I think DC and the areas surrounding DC are really unique.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. And,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that's one of the great ways and it's slightly complicated in terms of that urban, um, or not kind of question. You're saying, is that more true in like urban
Hmm.
communities? Um, to a degree, but also in urban communities, you also see a lot of high poverty schools too,
Sure.
and schools that are largely Black and Latino.
Hmm.
So, the most heavily segregated schools are actually New York, Illinois, Michigan, and New Jersey.
Interesting.
And because there's just more residential segregation.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then the other kind of bullet point of all of this is that it also depends on whether the community has a lot of school choice
Hmm.
embedded in their policies.
Hmm.
So some states do a lot of school choice. So they have a lot of like charter schools, for example.
Hmm.
And those schools tend to have a little bit higher segregation than others. It also depends on like some big cities have a lot of little bitty school districts. So like in Los Angeles, there's lots of little bitty
Hmm.
school districts.
Yeah, yeah.
And so those have much higher rates of segregation
Hmm.
because people move to the really specific school
Yeah.
district.
Hmm.
And so that's also, so it's like a really hard way to speak in generalities
Sure.
because every region of the country is different. Every state Department of Education is different, and every local school district is different.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine it is. I'm thinking in the past 30 years, I mean, obviously there's population growth, but then there's also, I mean, with Latinos, they've, I mean, exploded in terms of how they've grown as well. And I think they're 23% of the population of the United States, which I don't know what the numbers were in 88, but I know it was less than that. So, yeah, so I can imagine some of that is a factor, but I agree with, or based on what you're saying with the data, it's really interesting to think about, wow, like, there's more segregation again. And again, I've heard about this in California as well, where, there's certain areas and people will go to those schools, and then there's these other schools where they don't go. And not only do they not have resources or they don't have funding, but they have terrible conditions of learning. I mean, they don't have like functioning toilets and bathrooms, and they don't have supplies, and they don't have good places to sit and learn. And so qualitatively is a whole other angle here, right? Whereas, you have, maybe, 4 blocks down the road, a really nice big school with like all the amenities and like all of the great, kinds of, that definitely happens too often, unfortunately. And so it's fascinating what the segregation again.
Yeah, there was, a story I tell in the book is I was doing, so all of my research is always in school. So we go to schools and we interview kids. And, I was in a school waiting to talk to a principal, and it was almost an entirely Latino kids school. So it was Latino and Black. And the principal was running late. So I was just sitting in the front office, with the school secretary, just kind of killing time. And I finally got in to see the principal, and he apologized for running late. He said he had been on hold waiting for like the Office Depot or Office Max or one of those kind of big office supply stores. They had been asking for donations. The school was asking the store for donations because they did not have enough paper to make copies for their kids' test. Yeah. And because I was collecting data and wanted to vary the ethnic composition of the schools, I had been at another school earlier in the day. So it struck me because it was like within the same day. And the other school was giving me the tour of the brand new computer lab they had just built. And that school was predominantly white. And they were so proud of it. It was a computer lab that was off of the library. And then you get to the place where the guy just needs paper so his kids can take a test. And you're like, this is the same city. It was a 20-minute drive. But the one factor was resources, and the big difference was ethnicity of the kids.
Yeah. I've heard these stories, and every time it just like crushes me, right? Because it's like, kids, they don't there's no reason why they should suffer for that. And it's a failure for everyone else, all the adults that aren't doing enough to give them quality of education in a country like this. So it's just very frustrating. I want to ask about some of the immigration stuff you mentioned, and then we can also talk about the role of gender as well. You're talking about the challenges you already mentioned earlier about immigration laws, and how you tell a story is about Mexican Americans being displaced in the millions in the early 30s. And then more modern stuff in terms of the DREAM Act and DACA and all that. What can we say about just past, kind of like I just mentioned, and then kind of currently about where bias shows up in terms of immigration or for Latin Americans, past and present, and how that functions in the United States?
Yeah, I think the big one that really emerges for me is how much we've associated being, and again, this is particularly true for, I think, Latino immigrants, is how much we've associated that with being illegally in the United States. So we have really linked immigration and illegality really strongly. And so that the concept of, are they here with documentation or not? That is this really strong concern people have that is not really relevant for the level of a violation to the law that it is to come to the United States without documentation. Just to be in the United States without documentation is really only a misdemeanor. And yet we have really equated being an immigrant with being a criminal. And so I think that a lot of the biases we have stem from that basic kind of stereotype. So things like, back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, mass deportations where they would just round up anybody who looked vaguely Mexican. And some of them were American citizens. Some of them were veterans of like World War II who had fought for the United States. Some were here on legal work programs, and they were literally rounded up, put into railway cars, and driven into central Mexico. And the reports say they were taken to the central part of the country so that it was too far for them to get back into the U.S. And so I think that culture also started this, what they talk about is this like culture of fear. And so fear of being deported, and this again, it's independent of actual immigration status.
Right.
Back then, people were deported regardless of their immigration status, but being looked at, thought of as you must be here against the rules, you must be here illegally, so we're going to send you back. And so we see that really still showing up in kids' lives now. So that bias, really started from the beginning about mandating who could be here. And that's a really big form of bias that affects kids. The big court case I kind of talk about was kids' access to education and whether they have a right to public education regardless of their parents' documentation, and then you see that now with DREAM students and DACA. If you're, here when you're young and you've lived here your whole life, do you have a right to go to school? And so that's, I think, what we still see. And, each new administration in the U.S. has a different policy on it. So the policy is like constantly changing. And then you think, kids are looking at all of these shifts, and it's just a constant tug of war between worries about deportation. And kids aren't exactly the most accurate in terms of understanding how things work. And so kids, even regardless of their documentation status, have lots of fear and worry about being deported. Even if they're not at risk for being deported or their parents are not at risk, they live in a lot of fear. And so that's one of the big issues for kids.
Yeah, or I would say that they know somebody, they have a friend or a relative that knows someone that potentially is in fear of, or is in fear, I should say, of potentially being wrongfully harassed about their legal status or otherwise. And it is interesting. As far as my best of my knowledge, I think there's been some updates, throughout kind of what you're saying with each administration, and it's always a little different. But I think our current immigration laws are from '86, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, there's been, in terms of massive immigration reform, I think the last big one was in '86, and so many of our laws are severely outdated. On immigration and how we handle that. And so I think it's an interesting, I knew loosely about the history with Mexican Americans, but reading it in your book was a fresh reminder. And it's like, oh my goodness. And you can see a lot of the types of rhetoric on certain political sides with the same thing. And also, some of the state policies that are done on some of the border states and how they choose to use certain ways of making it difficult for immigrants. And so it still remains a big problem. You mentioned in the book that Latinos are the most segregated group now. Is this correct? That was surprising to me. That was can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, they are. And I think it is largely because of growing numbers. So yeah, Latino students, at least in terms of U.S. public schools, are about 26% of the population. And that's, growing each year, whereas Black students represent about 15%. And white students are down to about 48%. So partly it's an issue of they're growing in number, but still have those kind of economic restrictions. And then also you have the issue of ethnic enclaves, where people are kind of parts of immigrant kind of migration patterns that often move into specific areas. So often Latino students are clustered in certain specific kind of cities and within certain parts of town. So there's higher levels of residential segregation, which is probably in a lot of ways helpful. So back to your point of, are these things useful sometimes? Sometimes residential segregation is useful if there's good supports in your community, if there's good language supports, if there's good kind of community connections. The problem is when that's linked with lower economic resources, for example. But yeah, so I think it's partly the growing number, and then still being having high degrees of residential segregation means then their schools are at higher levels of segregation. So like Latino students are, so what that means is Latino students are more likely to go to school with other Latino students, so other same ethnicity peers, than any other ethnic group is. Black students are most likely to go to school with other Latino kids. And Asian kids more likely to go to school with white kids, and white students are actually lower on the rates of segregation because there's like a high number of white kids, but there's enough other kids kind of sprinkled in.
Is this where there's various biases, but is this where some of the kind of social kinds of class issues come into play here as well, in terms of where people are locating and where they're kind of originating in terms of their permanent homes and communities and where they're working and things like that? Or where does, I guess, class fit in here, or does it not at all?
No, I think class always fits in. I think when you're having conversations about race and ethnicity, I think in immigration, class always fits in, because these inequalities are really because of economics. So one of the devastating parts of schools being segregated is because when you have racial or ethnic segregation, you also have economic segregation. And so Black and Latino schools are also more likely to be high poverty schools. And so it's the high poverty part that's really the bad part. That's the one that can't pay for the highly trained teachers. It can't pay for the advanced placement classes. It can't pay for the well-stocked library. And a big part of this is families that have more economic resources. So higher, SES parents and families have a lot more choices. And so they're able to move to schools that they like. If they don't like any of the schools, they can choose to go to private schools. They can move to areas that are highly educated, where there's just more money spent on the school system. Whereas families that are closer to the poverty line, the kind of lower middle class, high poverty families have fewer choices. They got to go to the school that's down the street. For better or worse, that's where they have to go. And so, the market doesn't work for those families. They don't have the choice to say, well, I'm not going to choose this one. And, I am not really a fan of charter schools and those kinds of school choices, because what you have is then parents that can log on and read about the best school and then get their kid to that school because they have the transportation. Those families have the choice. But the other families, if your mom's working 2 or 3 jobs and dad may or may not be there, or maybe he's working 2 or 3 jobs and they don't, they're relying on public transportation, those kids are just going to go to the school at the end of the neighborhood. It doesn't matter what options are there. They're not able to access those. And when we defund those schools, those kids just don't really ever have a chance.
Yeah, I won't get on a tangent about charter schools. My understanding is I'm more aligned with you a little bit. My understanding of it is that there are some good charter schools.
Definitely.
They're pretty solid, but and it's been an interesting experiment. But that there are a lot of, I don't want to say bad ones, but ones where it's not advantageous to many other types of folks, and whether it's by intentionally or by accident or what have you, and it doesn't always shake out in the best way, and it's an interesting challenge now, but yeah, it's a kind of some good and bad charter schools, if you want to put it that way.
I would completely agree. I think that there's nothing inherently wrong with them. There's a lot less oversight, and I think oftentimes when you have less oversight, you see biases can run amok.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I think that's what you see here. And then also it means that other schools, and I do think there's unequal access. So I think that's my concern too.
Yeah. Fair enough. So let's talk about a few other topics here. I'm going to condense a few things here. So let's talk about Title IX and the role schools play here. Just remind listeners what Title IX is, and then we can talk about the involvement of schools in Title IX.
Yeah, I think Title IX, is most famously known as the thing that requires schools to offer girls' sports teams. I think we often think about Title IX is what requires there to be a girls' softball team at a high school. And basically what it is part of the education amendments. It was from the early 70s, 1972. And it just said that schools have to provide equal opportunities and access to all students regardless of gender. It said sex or gender, and the language kind of changed a bit over time. And so it's basically that you have to have equal treatment at schools if the schools get federal money. So in other words, public schools have to treat boys and girls equally is the kind of how it boils down to. It's known often for requiring it in sports. So you can't spend a ton more money on boys sports than you do girls sports. Where I became, and I'll say that was hugely successful. The ways in which that got girls involved in athletics was 200% greater involvement in sports after Title IX passed than before. Where I got really interested in it is one of the things we study in my lab is one form of gender discrimination, which is gender-based harassment and sexual harassment. And we see that Title IX also says that schools have to make sure that girls and boys have the same educational experience. And so if one of them is harassed or bullied or threatened repeatedly and in a pervasive way because of their gender, then schools have a responsibility to protect them. And so they not only have to have a softball team, but they also have to make sure girls aren't being harassed because of their gender as well. And that spent a lot of time in the court system, in which the courts finally said schools do, if it's pervasive and extreme forms, so it can't be one time somebody says something to you, but if it's this persistent and pervasive experience, then schools have a requirement to ameliorate that. And if they're not, then they'll be held financially responsible. And so once the courts say you have to pay if this happens, literally pay, then schools get remarkably responsive to the problem.
Right. That's right.
Like I said, it's always kind of about money.
It's back to money. Yeah, my dad used to say it all the time. He's like, well, it's all about money. So at the end of the day, everything's about money, unfortunately. I'm like, yeah, well. So I guess with Title IX, and where this, so there was, I'm a little fuzzy on this. I have a larger question here, but there was something the Obama administration changed, and then DeVos and company changed it back, or did it something different? And I don't know where it sits now. Could you just maybe more? This is very recent history. In the past 10 years, it's changed 3 times. So what? Tell us about that kind of timeline a little bit.
So. Okay, so Title IX was passed in the 70s, and then they didn't touch it. This courts went back and forth, and there wasn't really good guidance for schools. Okay, you tell us we have to treat everyone equally, but we don't really, what does that mean? What are we supposed to do on a Tuesday? Right? And there wasn't clear guidance. And so under Obama, they wrote what they called a Dear Colleagues letter. So they basically wrote a letter to the schools, which served as a kind of memo of understanding of saying, this is the guidance for what you should do if there's sexual harassment at your school. And so it wasn't part of the law, but it was guidance issued by the Department of Education. So the Department of Education is the division in the federal government that tells schools what they need to be doing to receive federal funding. They actually have their own Office of Civil Rights. So it's part of the Department of Education, and they're the ones that pay attention to this. They make sure that there's not racial discrimination and there's not gender discrimination, and they keep track of when does this happen. Schools have to report it. Schools have to have it what they call a Title IX officer. And if there's instances of gender discrimination or sexual harassment, the Title IX officer is supposed to report up to the Department of Education and say, hey, this is happening. This was also, but there was no real clear guidance. So under the Obama administration, they wrote this letter to say, here's what you're supposed to do when it happens. There was policies for how they should report it to the Department of Education. There were policies for if someone reports it. So if, say, a girl reports that this boy is consistently harassing her, they had policies for how to decide what to do. So she should be allowed to change classes, for example, or she should be allowed to move away from him. She should be able to, get distance. He needs to have consequences. There needs to be parents called. All sorts of kind of rules for how to manage it. Well, when the next administration came in 2016, Betsy DeVos was appointed as the Secretary of Education. So she took over that Department of Education. And one of her big things she even talked about, she talked about it in her confirmation hearings, in fact, and she was true to her word. She believed that it was too easy for girls, and this was pretty gendered, so she thought it was too easy for girls to make false complaints against innocent boys. So that if, as a girl, I said, that boy harasses me, he could be perfectly innocent, but his reputation would be tarnished by that false accusation. And so basically, she said there were too many victim-focused policies and not enough protections for those who were accused. And so they rescinded that colleague's letter that the Obama administration had written. They said, we need to focus less on protections for the victims, and we need to be more thoughtful about the protections for the people that are accused because they may be wrongfully accused. That was the big change. And they said, Obama said schools need to be proactive and teach about, they need to have educational kind of lessons about sexual harassment. They need to be proactive about it. If it's happening, they need to have a bigger policy. Betsy DeVos removed all of those, basically. And she removed them while making them law. So what Obama did not do, they just issued a memo.
Right.
And so it didn't have the force of law behind it. So then under the DeVos administration of the Department of Ed, they actually made changes that then got passed into law. And so now administration has changed again. They've reinstituted some of it, but now they're trying to figure out, I think, how to make more permanent changes. So really all it is what do schools do if someone makes a complaint? Do they, under DeVos, here just an example. Under DeVos, they said that the accused has the right to question the accuser. And so in a kind of hearing, they have the right to question them back. Under the Obama guidance, it said that's that they didn't have that. The idea is that that's pretty traumatic if you've been because this includes like sexual assault. So the idea is if you've been sexually assaulted, and then you tell a teacher. Under the DeVos rules, it says the person that you've said has raped you, for example, has the right to question you back in a public forum.
So I guess my question, so Title IX started out as something one way, and it's branched out into all of this stuff. It's my reading of this, I guess, is that all of this stuff happened because for 40 years no one made any applied guidelines within the law. It was just like, okay, we did a law, but we didn't institute it in ways that that's a gross negligence for 40 years. It's like, what is going on? But I guess my question here is, and maybe you do or don't have opinions on it, or you don't have to share if you don't want to, or of course I would love to you too if you do have opinions on it, is how much do we think schools like how much involvement should schools have in the personal lives of students? Now, obviously, there are things that are going to reflect the school and the institution, of course, but maybe it's just this kind of dance of sorts of like, yes, we should be involved, but not too involved. Like, how much, I guess, involvement should schools have with this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's an important distinction in that I think schools should be involved in what happens at school. So I don't think schools have a role in what somebody says to me on a Saturday night in wherever teenagers hang out on Saturday nights now.
Right.
But I was going to use a totally outdated reference, but if it happens in the schools, I think schools have a responsibility. And that's because kids don't have a choice about being at that school. So as long as the government requires a kid to go to school and the government's going to pay for that education, we have a right to make sure kids feel safe in that building. Sure. And so I think that's the important distinction. So I don't think schools have an obligation to monitor what their kids are doing online, for example. And there's a lot, I'll say that because there's a lot of sexual harassment that happens online, whether it be via text or whether it be via, DMs on Instagram. That happens. I think that's not the school's responsibility because I don't see how you can police that. But a lot of sexual harassment happens in the hallways, in the band rooms, in the gym. And I do think kids are have a reasonable expectation to feel safe at their school.
Yeah, certainly.
And we know that this stuff affects how kids are doing in school. And so I think the schools have a responsibility there. And I think that schools are really good at managing other behaviors, right? Schools have never shied away from managing bullying, right? That's the personal lives of kids. Like we have a very zero tolerance for bullying policies.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
And so this is the same thing. I mean, I think we just need to start treating this as a form of bullying and not a form of just, that's just boys being boys, or that's just how they express themselves. You don't need to rate a girl's body parts as she walks down the hallway, right? I think we have a right to police that, because that's just doesn't have a place in the school hallway.
Yeah, I think I would mostly agree with you on that. Actually, I think I like that kind of parsing it out in that way. Look, if it's on school grounds and this is happening in buildings, school buildings, school grounds, we're going to police it. And that's how I agree with that. I think, and some people won't like it and some people won't. I mean, I guess in terms of the, DeVos thing, I mean, that's going to happen. I mean, there's going to be people that are going to abuse something and it's going to happen in the other way. I mean, people abuse laws and rules all the time. I mean, like that happens doesn't mean they shouldn't have protections for people that are, being assaulted.
Yeah. And so what I wish schools would do is more education of teaching kids this is not a good way to interact with each other. So how can we talk, kids, they have health classes, they have other forms of kind of what we call civic education. Schools do a lot of social emotional learning. How can we just like integrate this and not assume that this is just teenagers being teenagers? But how can we just talk about this as, no, we have a better way to respect each other? Because I think that a lot of this stems from, I don't think it's a lot of, sexual predator boys roaming the hallways looking to pounce on girls. I think it's they're trying their best to live up to what they think they're supposed to do. They're pretty awkward about it. And, I think anybody that knows 14-year-old boys knows they're kind of morons, just like 14-year-old girls are.
Yes, it's a difficult time.
And so I think that it doesn't come from, to use your word from before, it's not coming from a nefarious place. It's coming from a awkwardness, hormone fueled
transitional,
awkwardness.
transitional
Right.
place. Yeah.
And so I think it's a great learning opportunity. So if we think about it less in this punitive way, and if we just talked about it more with kids in that age range, I think we could change the culture a lot. And I think that's more important than,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a much easier approach to take, one that feels kinder and more developmentally appropriate.
I fully agree with you. And while we're, I guess, still on since Title IX has a lot of kind of the gender and kind of the standard way in which people think about it. One aspect is about, I wanted to ask about, you talk about in the second part of the book, but since we're here, maybe we'll talk about it here, is about STEM and girls in particular in STEM. This is a big push, I guess decades ago, maybe not that long, but I definitely know over the past 10, 15 years, big push for this. And I'm just wondering, where's the payoff on some of these campaigns and initiatives? We hear about this stuff a whole lot, and many people have put their money where their mouth is. They put funding behind this stuff, and more places offer various opportunities in STEM for girls. Have we seen an increase in girls choosing STEM fields? What's the data here? Where's I guess, if there's any progress or payoffs on this stuff?
Yeah, there is progress in some areas and not in others. So overall, about 27%, so about a quarter of STEM workers, so people that are doing jobs in STEM fields, are women.
Okay.
So, so it's better than it used to be. Still, women are 50% of the population roughly. And so it's still pretty big underrepresentation in STEM fields. However, it really depends on the STEM field. So when you're looking at biological sciences, so like pre-med, for example, you see a lot of women going into that. That's really equally distributed. So the biological sciences, no gender gap. When there is, it almost favors girls a bit. Favors women.
I was going to say, I think medical doctors, as soon as they like first year out, I think it's just tipped now where it's like 55, 45 women to men. I think.
Yes.
Maybe I could be wrong on that,
that's about right. That's about right.
Yeah.
You also see that it differs a bit, even within medicine, though. You see there's differences in like what fields they go into. So where you see the differences in like women are more likely to go into, be pediatricians. So medicine and the biological sciences completely erase the gap. Where you see the big gaps now are engineering and computer sciences. So there you still see really big ones. Something like 18% of engineers are women. Kind of depends on if you're looking at college versus careers. So it's computers and engineering is where the real gaps still remain. So yes, change, but not in some domains.
Some of the counters I've heard to this, I'm curious for your opinion on this, is that some people will say that in the abstract, in the general abstract, it's not, obviously not for everybody, that many women have certain interest in certain things, interest in people, and men have more interest in things. Again, these are generalizations. Do you think kinds of interests has anything to do with why it's still lower, I guess, in engineering or computer science, or is that you don't like that data, or what are your thoughts on I guess some of that?
Yeah, so part of that question is the women being interested in kind of the social interactions and men into kind of objects and things like that. That was based on some really bad data from the 70s. So that actually doesn't seem to be a difference. However, there definitely is difference in socialization towards women being helpers and being focused on emotions and interpersonal interactions. Lots of research showing that there's definitely a socialization differences. So I don't think there's anything innate, but definitely we do socialize boys and girls differently. But we also see that girls start endorsing stereotypes by the time they're about 6, that girls are not good at math and boys are. So you see that cultural expectation shifting really as soon as kids get into school. And so I think that then even when girls are doing well in math, one difference you see is that girls tend to have more math anxiety. So anxiety around math and less confidence in their math, whereas boys are overconfident in their math. So they're more confident than their grades warrant. And so part of it is that girls are self-selecting out of some of these things, partly because they think this is just not for me. So it's hard to know, well, what's really an interest versus what's just society told you should do or not do.
Yeah.
Now, that said, I don't think we need to shove everybody into engineering. Like, not everyone's going to be interested in engineering. I think that the reason I care about this, well, for one, is that those STEM jobs typically are higher paying than other jobs. And so one of the problems is if women are not going into careers that are higher paying, you tend to see financial inequalities later on, and that becomes concerning. But I also think the reality is that some girls would be really good at those things and they self-select out. But I also think that some men would be really good kindergarten teachers and would be really good at nurturing tasks. And we don't let men do those very easily either. And so that to me is just as much of a concern and gets way less attention, right? You see tons of girls in STEM programs. You don't see many boys in education, boys in nurturing jobs. You don't see that attention. And so that's, I think also part of the problem. So I do think if we left to our own culture-free devices, I'm sure there's going to be just natural variation in who's interested in building bridges and who's interested in taking care of babies. Now, I don't think that really differs along gendered lines as much as we've made it. And I wish we could get to a place where people could just gravitate towards the things they were interested in, free of those cultural expectations.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. I definitely think that there is probably some of the what is it that I'm able to do, or where am I going to have the most chances of doing something in? That's definitely playing in the background for sure. I agree with you on that. Before we get to just the last part of the book and some of the more practical stuff you talk about, I want to talk about the LGBTQ plus community. You mentioned it in the book. You talk about some of the biases there. We're having some debates about that in our society and culture at the moment. So maybe just talk about some of the historical biases in the legal system with the LGBTQ population, and then we've made progress in the United States and other places around the world, and where are we still needing to make progress at present?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically, one of the big things, one of the things to talk about in the book especially, is protections for kids at school being bullied. I think bullying towards gay kids has been really profound, and same Title IX, same equal protection kind of laws that used for this have been used for protection here. So it's another time Title IX gets pulled out and used. But it took courts a long time to figure out that if I'm bullying you because you're gay, that's also related to kind of sex and gender. And so the schools also have a responsibility to protect you there. So that was a big change, and that took a lot of years. And the schools were financially responsible for some of the kids that could prove that they had been bullied for years in really severe, heartbreaking ways. And the schools really said, well, you're just asking for it. Just get over it. And it was so egregious that the courts finally ruled. And so that was important because it set policy that the schools do have financial liabilities if their kids are bullied there because of sexual orientation. That's been a big one. The other big one has been that's still been working its way through the courts is trans kids using bathrooms aligned with their gender identity at the school. So what kind of bathroom can the kid use? That's been a case that's also been working its way through the Supreme Court. And I'm sure it's going to get a lot more attention. And now that all these state laws are trying to weigh in on which sports teams kids can be on. That's going to be in the courts for the next 10 years. One thing I learned is getting these laws changed takes
decades.
A really long time.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think so what the issues, it has been interesting. Like this is a group that has seen the biggest shifts, though, I think, in terms of progress, the most rapid cultural change. But where the challenges really still are kids still every day use the word gay to mean stupid. And they use it daily, and teachers don't say anything, and kids may not know. In elementary school, we know that kids don't even necessarily know what gay means, but they'll still say the word gay to mean stupid. And so that's part of it, is that it's just treated as kind of an everyday slur. And that's one of the big kind of issues that we got to really shift that. That's surprisingly persistent, I think. I mean, it was common when I was a kid. It's common in middle schools today. The other thing is that you don't see a lot of... So I think as adults, we see TV shows that often have a, gay best friend. There's lots of kind of LGBT characters in media that adults are consuming, but we don't see it in media that kids are consuming, and we don't see same-sex families in kids' media. And so my concern about that is that you have a kid who's, 6, 7, 8 years old who will, once they know themselves, will identify as gay, but having a happy, healthy family has just been invisible from their media diet. And so it's hard to kind of envision that. Whereas if we could see a range of families, then as a kid, you grow up and you're like, oh yeah, I can be gay and be a mom. Those are not, lesbian and be a mom. Those are not incompatible. So it's like adults, I think, forget that we see it in our sitcoms and things like that, but we don't see it in kids' media. So I talk about it in the book as though it's like these everyday slurs on the one hand, and then authentic, just regular families are really invisible. So it's one is all over the place, and then one is completely invisible from a kid's point of view. And so I think that's the real challenge in the future, is how do we help kids know what gay really means, know that you can have a healthy, happy family. Because for a kid, that's what it means to a kid. If you're 7 years old, it's not about sex. It's about what kind of family, right? That's the family unit is what matters to kids. And so I think that's where I would like to see progress in the future. And then we got to figure out all these policies of letting kids just use the bathroom and be on the sports teams that align with their gender identity. And they're using the same laws they're using the same arguments from the 50s, with race. It's been interesting to see the legal precedents they're using are the same. The arguments against are the same. So we're really seeing history repeat itself, just with a different category.
Yeah, I agree. I think change is usually pretty slow, for better or for worse. And I think much of the United States is still conservative in some ways, small c. And there's a huge progressive streak as well, without a doubt. But it's, you got to drag some folks along, just all right, well, come on, let's get there. Someone or have a family member or whatever that's, in this population, and it's fine. It's still your family. You have a coworker, you have, whatever. And, how do we make the world a more legitimately, not just as a kind of, hashtag kind of thing, legitimately make it more inclusive for them, right? How do they feel, represented, but also part of, the community or the area they're in, or, the job they're in, or the school they're in, legitimately, and seeing that person, and accepting them for who they are. I think when it's hard to do that at scale. It's not hard, but it's hard for some people to get that at scale and fast enough. I think there's plenty of folks and plenty of places and plenty of districts and jobs and schools and things like that are there, or they're doing a good job, or they're making the right strides. But other places are, it's taking them a lot longer, and that's how it goes.
It's been an interesting, because I study all these different kinds of groups. It's always interesting to me to see where there's similarities and where there's differences.
Sure. Yeah.
And what's interesting about like LGBTQ issues is that it has seen more rapid growth towards kind of acceptance and inclusion and the reduction of bias than in race, for example, or immigration status. And one argument's been that, kind of to the point you just embedded in that, is with race, it's easy to live in a segregated world, right? We've just talked about how much segregation there is. But pretty much everybody knows somebody, or there was a nephew in their family, or they had a cousin who came out as gay, and you loved them before you knew they were gay.
Yeah.
And so that connection was formed, and then you had to make peace with it. So most people can't just stop unloving a kid that they've loved. Plenty do, but most people don't. And so you have to then change your attitudes about sexual orientation. And so an argument's been, you can go your whole life and never know someone of a different ethnicity, but most people have someone in their family that's gay. And so because of that connection, and the fact that you loved them, like you knew them as an individual before you knew the group membership, that it's led to quicker changes. And then I think the role of media has been really important. Like among like adult media, and I don't mean, X-rated.
I know what you mean.
That's consumed by adults,
right.
Not targeted to kids. I always have to be careful. I don't mean adult media. But in that, like LGBTQ individuals are actually overrepresented relative to the population. There's more gay characters on television than in the US, percentage-wise. And so when you see someone in your living room, or, nowadays on your laptop screen, when you binge that over a weekend or you watch it every week, it does change how much you feel like you know people. And so that has led to real, I think, big shifts in a ways that we haven't seen with, for example, race.
Yeah. I think where there's some push here with race, and of course not everyone, I'm not saying should do this or that's what it needs to happen for that to happen, but I think you see this with mixed ethnicities and mixed race families. It's like, my mom is this, my dad is this. They're different races. Like I love my parents, and I love my family on both sides. Like and they love me. Like it's, I think we see a lot of that. And, I do think just because of how fast we're growing in the United States in some ways, and because of lots of immigration and other things, we're seeing the younger generation just being mixed with a bunch of stuff. And that's, I think, going to be more and more common in the next, subsequent generations, which will make the makeup different. And I think it will downstream have, there'll always be new challenges, but I think hopefully my optimism is that it will push some of these other things a little bit faster. But it just, generational stuff is tough. Which,
I think you're right.
Which I guess leads me to some of my final questions here is, you talk about how we see bias in institutions, we see it in society, and we see it in different aspects of our daily life. And so what do we do about it, right? And so how do we reduce bias? And you say a few things. I guess the two things, one of those we've already been sort of talking about, but you mentioned in the book about ways in which children can be involved in speaking out against biases in schools and maybe in their communities. And I'll be honest, I read it and I said, this is great, but is this too much to ask kids? This is a lot to do. Is this a lot? Man, they're just trying to hopefully just, play and have
learn fractions.
fun and games on the playground or whatever kids are doing nowadays. And this is a lot for them to be checking. I guess just kind of unpack it a little bit of how you see it, and realistically how, what kids could do, and then obviously what parents and certain institutions, whether it's a school or the YMCA or whatever it is, can reduce bias.
Yeah, that's great. I don't think kids need to be taking the LSATs and or half the ACLU. But I do think that a lot of this stuff so there's research that suggests things like peer norms can help shift attitudes, right? And so peer norms that are against biases help trickle out and spread across the networks and actually reduce biases in a classroom, for example. So I think there are things that kids can do when they hear another. So this is getting really down to the small level, the real concrete stuff. So if a kid hears another kid make fun of somebody, they can say, hey, that's not cool. Stop doing that. Right? That's working against bias. That's fighting bias. So I don't necessarily think kids need to be tasked with structural changes. Right. But kids do set the norm for what is okay behavior with each other. And kids really know it. If a kid wears the wrong, outfit or plays a game that the other ones deem as a baby game, then kids will let you know that that's not okay. And so kids, if they're taught, you can do that for these types of stereotypes and discrimination too, then it can start to trickle into the culture at the kid level. I think of my own kid who was in the 2nd or 3rd grade at the time, back before COVID hit, and and was in the library, and the librarian was passing out stickers. And I heard this from a teacher that overheard it. My own kid didn't report it to me, but apparently the teacher was passing out stickers and was giving boys superhero stickers and the girls princess stickers. And my kid said to the teacher, hey, Miss Jones, I don't know if you know, but that's actually a gender stereotype. And the teacher's like, oh yeah, I guess you're right here, which, and started asking everybody. And so my kid was respectful about it, but did a very kind of nice call out. And so I think it's that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of it is just when kids overhear bullying or rejection or some of that type of those comments that we know kids say to each other, kid can say, hey, that's not cool. We don't talk to each other like that. So I think that's the way in which kids can get involved. And so I think part of it is helping kids know how to do that and talking to them about it, helping them kind of role play a little bit with it. As kids gets older, I think kids do often, as kids get into adolescence, I think adolescents do look for causes. And so I think there's lots of ways that adolescents can get involved at the more structural level, but at the local level though, like at the school level. How can you, what is our school's policy about sexual harassment? Can we make some signs to hang up around the school building that say, this is not okay? Right? Do we make sure kids know who to report harassment to? Because we know that kids often don't know who you actually go report it to. So I think that part of it is thinking about, well, from a kid's perspective, what are the things that are like the school's not doing that kids could help out? Because I think kids do play a really powerful role in shaping what's okay and not okay. And then the parents have to do the adult stuff, right? The advocating for the kid, the checking in with what are the policies. Let me email the superintendent. Let me kind of get involved at that bigger level.
Yeah, no, that's very good. It's tangible, and I think it's important. I think always the line with that is is true for anything, I guess. But it's how involved do you get, and make sure you respect people's boundaries, but also you respect when there's indiscretion as well. And so I think that sometimes my own daughter will ask me, like, should I say something here? Sometimes I do, but it's actually not my business. Like, I wasn't involved there. And so it's hard. And I think sometimes this stuff is just, it can sometimes be case by case, but otherwise in some moments it is more of look, if you don't know, you can't figure it out, which way do you want to roll the dice on this? Right. Would you rather do it on this and maybe get hit with, hey, that's none of your business? Fine, but at least you tried, right. or not. And I think it just really it can sometimes depend, but I think as a general heuristic, what you're saying, I think is really good. Kind of the last question I have for you is, kind of we were talking about it before, but culture change is really tough, and slow and and really difficult sometimes, even if it doesn't have to be. So I guess just a general kind of forward-looking thing. Where do you think the future holds for kids and for people as different generations as we get older, and how do we combat negative stereotypes and our biases and how we see the world and make the world a little bit better?
I mean, it's always hard to write a book about bias and then continue to have like optimism. It's not the greatest thing, especially while writing a book over a global pandemic. I think, to call back to one of the things you mentioned, where I am optimistic, is I do see as the country gets more ethnically diverse and youth are less bothered by racial diversity, you see more friendships across race lines and ethnic lines. You also see more dating, and then you therefore see more marriages. Therefore, you see more multiracial kids. And so I think that's actually a really positive, from my point of view, a positive cultural shift, because I do think as we all become individually more diverse, the appreciation for diversity is obviously going to then increase. I'm sure that'll bring some downstream negative things too, but I think that's actually really positive. I think we're going to start recognizing that because all of us are ethnically diverse. We just, some folks, it's further, it's all more complicated, right? And so I think that's actually really positive, because we start to see that these really aren't important distinctions. That our culture brings interesting things, but it doesn't need to bring barriers. And so that is really positive. I think a lot of the controversies we see in the news lately is partly because more and more groups are realizing that more and more groups are fighting for equal rights. And so that means the people that have held the power are going to fight back. And going to push back against that. But I am choosing to think that that's actually a positive sign, that these court cases and these laws are because people are becoming more vocal and people are saying, no, we deserve equal rights. And so, as people in power always do, they try to maintain the power. And so that's just part of what we've seen through history. And that all of these, though, ultimately lead towards cultural shifts of acceptance of really just human diversity, that we're all really different in lots of ways. And that really makes us more interesting. And so I think right now we're seeing some pushback against that. But ultimately that's, what is it? The arc of justice, it's slow, but it's, I think ultimately we're getting to where we're more inclusive, but it's definitely going to have some growing pains.
Yeah, certainly. I ask me on which week I'm more optimistic or more pessimistic. Depends on the week sometimes, but I think yes. In the aggregate, I think we're it's much better.
I'm choosing to believe it, whether it's completely diluted or not, I don't know. But I'm choosing to hold on to that, and
that's right. Yeah, I'm with you.
That's my coping mechanism.
Well, the book is Unraveling Bias: How Prejudice Has Shaped Children for Generations and Why It's Time to Break the Cycle. Where can people find the book, and where can people find you and all your research and all the good stuff you're doing?
You can find the book wherever books are sold. So find whatever bookstore you like and hopefully buy it there. And then I'm on Twitter at ChristiaBrown.com or Christia Brown, and then online just ChristiaBrown.com. Instagram, but not great. Also, Christia Brown.
That's great.
Pretty easy. It helps when you have an unusual first name.
Listen, I can identify. I can relate. I can definitely relate. Well, look, I mean, this was so much fun. I really really enjoyed it, and I was happy to get you on and talk about the important topic. And the time always goes by fast. So this is super enjoyable. I appreciate you giving me your time and your mind and your energy, and so I can't say enough thanks to you.
Well, I appreciate the conversation.
All right. Thank you. All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.